Hey folks, welcome back for another episode of Code Club. In today's episode, I am going to be building out a visual from the magazine The Economist. This is an article about the glass ceiling index. So every year, The Economist puts out an update to this index. It is released around March 8th, which is International Women's Day. March, I believe, is Women's History Month. And so it's appropriate to be considering this. And basically, the glass ceiling index, as they say in their headline here, indicates the best places, the countries, to be working as a woman in 2025. This index is composed of about 10 different factors that if you come down to the bottom part of the article, they talk about things like gender gap in higher education, percent of GMAT, which is a standardized test taken by women, labor force participation, gender wage gap, and so forth. And so they basically compile all that together and come up with a ranking of 29 countries and compare it to the OECD average. I forget what OECD stands for, but these are largely economically developed countries. And so this plot shows the ranking of each country since 2016 going forward to last year of 2024. Of course, I'm always concerned about the US because that's where I live, right? And so you'll see US here, United States at 20, and it finishes at tied for 19, so basically 20, right? So a few things stood out to me about this plot, namely that they have rankings for each of these countries by year going from left to right. And so that's interesting to me. Another interesting thing to me was that you can see where the lines intersect with each other because there's a white edge to each of these lines. To me, this is a lot like my favorite plotting symbol, number 21, where you can have, say, a red center and a white outline. We've done that a few episodes back when looking at a scatter plot where we noticed that there's kind of a halo around the points. Well, this effectively has a halo around each of the lines. So again, you can kind of see the separation between the lines that are overlapping with each other. Another thing that was interesting to me was that the color of each of the lines is determined by the final ranking of each of the countries, with a low-ranked country like Turkey being red and a high-ranked country like Sweden being blue. The average line, though, OECD, is a pretty dark gray, and it doesn't fit within the continuum of red, gray, blue, right? And so we'll have to think about how we're going to draw in the OECD line to be a darker gray than what it normally would have been for this three-tone color gradient. Another thing about that OECD average is that it is bolded, whereas all the other fonts in the listing of countries are in a regular font. Also, we have rankings of the countries back in 2016, as well as coming forward here to 2024. One thing I noticed about 2024 is that there are ties, right? So there's a three-way tie for fifth place between France, New Zealand, and Portugal. The lines all converge to the same point, but they show up separately in the listing. Also, there's a tie for Greece and the United States, and also for Britain and Canada. One thing I noticed, though, as I looked back through all the other years, is that there were no ties. And so this makes me wonder if perhaps there were ties, but we're just not seeing it, right? And so what we notice is that for every year, all 29 of the rankings are present along with the OECD average, and that OECD average takes on its own ranking, right? So that's a bit odd to me, is that there's no ties at earlier years and that the OECD average basically takes up a rank itself, right? Although the numbering of the countries doesn't go, say, 12 Portugal, 14 Spain, or 18 Ireland, 20 Greece, and the United States. It's a cool plot. I thought it was interesting. I'm not going to quibble and critique it too hard, but I was interested in how we would go about making this in R. And so if you want to get a link to this article, go down below in the description for today's episode. Also down there, you will see a link to a newsletter where I talked about this visual and how I'd go about recreating it at like a 30,000 foot view. Finally, here in our studio, I have an R script, glassceilingIndex.r, that has our data roughed in along with a ggsave statement to give us the visual in the same aspect ratio that they had in the original plot. If you want to get this script, as well as all the code that I generate over the course of today's episode, again, down in the description, you'll find a link to a blog post where you can go and see the final code. So let's go ahead and load the tidyverse, show text, and ggtext. The tidyverse will get us things like dplyr and ggplot2. Show text will allow us to use the Roboto condensed font. This isn't exactly Roboto. The Economist has its own font, but this is a pretty close substitute to the Economist version of the font. And so we'll go ahead and load that in. And so we can get this font family by using Roboto as the name. And I also then extracted from the plot each country's rank from 2016 going forward to 2024. This slides off the right side of the screen. So I'm gonna go ahead and bump that down a line so that my screen doesn't wag back and forth. And I can go ahead and run this to then get data, which is going to be a wide data frame. So you'll notice I also have some comments to the right side of this table. So for example, France and New Zealand were 5th, but in the listing on the right side of the screen, France was 5th, whereas New Zealand was 6th, right? And I've got the same for Canada and Britain, as well as Portugal was also tied for 5th, right? It also gets complicated because like United States and Greece were 20th if we count the OECD, right? That was basically 19th place, but that bumps down Greece and the United States to 20th. Regardless, then, Greece was 20th in the list, and the United States was 21st in the list. So we have a lot to do today. I think the plot is deceptively simple, and I think it's going to get tricky here pretty quick. Again, we have our data frame. And so maybe what we'll start by doing is taking data and making a line plot. So we'll go ahead and pipe this to ggplot2. If we think about what we want to map across the x-axis, the y-axis, and the color, we need to think about columns that we're going to be able to map there, right? And so like on the x-axis, we'd like to put the year, but currently our years are across all of the columns, right? And for our y, we'd like to have the rank, right? And then the color, well, we're gonna want the rank as of 2024, but we're not there yet. So for now, let's put country in there, right? And then we'll want to plot the data with geom_line. Of course, we don't have a year and rank column, so if I run this, it's going to complain, right? So what we need to do is we need to take data and we need to pivot it longer to get the column names to be the years and the values in each of those columns to be the rank. So we'll do pivot longer, and we'll do minus country, and we'll do names to, and I'll say year, and then values to, and we'll say rank. And now when we pipe that, it's now complaining because it says each group consists of only one observation. Do you need to adjust the group aesthetic? Yes. When we're using geom_line, we do need to use the group aesthetic. And so we'll say group equals country. And basically what this is doing is saying all of, say, the ranks for the United States or for Greece, they all belong in the same line. Very cool. We now have the makings of our plot. Of course, we have this monster legend that we'll get rid of. I'm also noticing that the order is flipped, right? So you'll notice like Switzerland, Turkey, Japan, South Korea are the bottom 4, and they don't change, but here they're the top 4. So we'll have to deal with that as well. Let's go ahead and get rid of that legend, and we could do that with show.legend equals false. Great, we got rid of the legend on the right side. Let's go ahead and see if we can flip the order of those lines. So I'm gonna go ahead and add scale y continuous, and we'll then do transform equals reverse. And so this should reverse the order of the y-axis. We now see that those 4 countries that are relatively constant are across the bottom, whereas the ones that were more of those Nordic countries like Iceland are up at the top here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the expansion from the data. You'll notice that the data starts at 2016 and ends at 24. There is a bit of an expansion on the y-axis. I'm going to prefer to control that myself. Then we'll do chord Cartesian. So we'll do expand equals false. And again, that puts the lines out to the edges. Of course, we now see that there's some clipping of our line at the 30 and at the 0 or the 1 up at the top, right? And so we'd like to add a bit of padding there. So in scale y continuous, I'll go ahead and do limit. So I'm going to do it in descending order. So normally for the limits, you give the minimum and the maximum. And so because we've got the reverse, which we saw here, right? We have 30 here and we have 1 up at the top. Go ahead and do 31, 0 because I want to add space to the top and bottom. And so again, that adds that desired space to the top and bottom of the plot. Let's go ahead and add the title. So I'll copy this into our studio. We'll come and do labs title equals the index rank out of 29 countries. We're gonna have to do some styling. It is going to be centered and bolded and a little bit smaller, but let's not worry about that just yet. We'll wanna get rid of rank and year. We can do that in labs. So we'll do X equals null, Y equals null. So that gets rid of those titles. So we'll wanna do some further modification of our axes. So the Y-axis doesn't have any ticks, and it also has the names rather than the number. Ultimately, what we're gonna do is I think we're gonna put the text in on both sides using geom text. And so we'll ultimately kind of bring things in from the margins, from the edges. So we'll wanna go ahead and get rid of this Y-axis text as well as the ticks. And then on the X-axis, we'll wanna get rid of the ticks and modify the text. Ticks and texts, aye. All right, so we'll do that with theme. So do theme, and we'll do axis.ticks equals element blank. And then we'll do axis.text.y equals element blank. So that got rid of all of the tick marks as well as the y-axis text. Now we want to modify our x-axis text. So first, I know that when we use theme gray, which is the default theme, it sets the text on the axes to be a grayish color. So let's go ahead and change that to be axis.text.x to be element text. And we'll do color equals black. And while I'm in here thinking about text in my theme, I'm gonna go ahead and change from the default font to the Roboto font. And so we'll do text equals element text family equals Roboto. And so we now see the Roboto font for the title as well as for the x-axis. Now we want to change the x-axis text to be 2016 and then 18, 20, 22, and 24, rather than being every year with the full 4-digit year. We can do that back up here. So we'll add scale x continuous, and we'll do breaks of 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, 2024. Normally I might do this type of vector where I've got evenly spaced numbers using the seek function, but there's only 5 things here. And I think for readability with the labels, which is the next thing I'll put in, it makes sense to have it written out. So again, labels, we'll do 2016, 18, 20, 22, and 24. And so again, I think this is just nice to be able to kind of see how things align with each other and what the label goes with in terms of the break. I need a comma there. All right. Oh, and I forgot a plus sign at the end. Regardless of my typos, it's complaining that I'm using discrete values supplied to a continuous scale. And so if you recall, data, after we do the pivot longer here, has a year column, but it is of type character because those came from the column names, right? So let's go ahead in here and we'll do a mutate on year being as.numeric on year. And so that should turn our years now to be continuous and work well with our continuous scale. So now we see we've got the 2016, 18, 20, 22, and 24. That matches well with what they have. Because we're already doing a little bit of work on the axes, let's go ahead and add the x-axis line. They have that on theirs. We'll also go ahead and get rid of the background and change the vertical major grid lines to be a light gray color to match theirs and get rid of the other grid lines. So we'll come back into theme and let's go ahead and do axis.line.x equals element line. And that gets us a solid black line at the bottom. So that might be a little bit thicker than theirs, I think. So again, in here, we could do line width equals 0.25. Appears to match theirs pretty well. Happy with that. Now let's go ahead and clear out the background. And so in here, we'll then do panel.background equals element blank. And we'll also do panel.grid.minor equals element blank. I'm going to wait to turn off the background color because I want to see if those grid lines are there. So we'll remove the minor grid lines. We'll also do panel.grid.major.y to be element blank. And we need a comma. So what we should get here, if I'm predicting right, is we'll have a gray background, right? but that our vertical major grid lines will be those will be the grid lines on those even years. But we won't have the minor grid lines or the horizontal grid lines. Cool, our prediction was correct. Now we want to turn those vertical grid lines from being white to being gray. And so now what we'll do is panel.grid.major.x equals element line. We'll do color equals gray. Now we'll go ahead and turn off the background and probably make those grid lines a bit thinner. Let's do that first. So we'll do line width equals 0.2. And then back up here, our panel background, we can blink that out. Very good. We now see that we have those thin gray vertical lines. Great. All right. And so because we put the title in and we're already mucking with the theme function, let's go ahead and change that. I think we need to shrink it, make it bold, and then center justify it. And so we can do that. Back up here, let's go ahead and do plot.title equals element text. And we'll do face equals bold. Let's do size equals 10. And so comparing that, I think it could be a little bit larger. And of course, I need to center it, right? And so let's take that up to say 12. And we'll do hjust equals 0.5. And so now we see that it is centered, but it's a little too big. So let's go ahead and knock that down to say 11. And maybe I'll take it to 10.5 just to try to be as close as possible. So I think that looks pretty good. It's not quite at the same horizontal position, but I think it's pretty close. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Let's go ahead now and add in the margins to our figure. We'll do plot.margin equals margin. And then on the left, let's do 75, right, do 75 to have those nice wide margins for putting in the country names. Wow, and wouldn't you know it that I got that pretty much dead on. The right is 75, the left might be more like 70 or 73. I don't know that it really matters. We do need to add a little bit of margin to the top. And so I'll do let's do 5. And then looking at the bottom, that also needs a bit of a margin. So we'll do, so it typically goes TRBL, trouble. So let's go ahead and reorder these to be in the correct order, or at least the order of the defaults. And then the B, let's make that say 10, and we'll see how that looks. All right, so the bottom is too high. Let's go ahead and bring that down to say 5. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and add maybe a little bit of margin between the title and the plot. And so back up here with plot.title, where was that? Right here. We'll go ahead and do margin equals margin. And then the B, let's do 10 for the bottom. Kind of putting these side by side. That seems to be a pretty good separation, and I think everything else lines up pretty well. Now what I'd like to do is let's go ahead and thicken our lines, and we'll start thinking about incorporating the color to those lines, all right? So let's come back to geom line, and we can do line width equals 2. All right, so I think those lines are definitely beefier, but they're still a little too thin. So let's go ahead and increase that to say 2.5. Maybe that now is too thick. So let's split the difference and do 2.25. And I think that looks pretty good. So one thing I'm noticing about the ends of our lines is that the middle of the line goes to 2016 or 2024, right? So because some of these are at an angle then, there's a bit of a gap like we see all the way up here with Iceland, right? Like that line just has an angle, and so there's a gap between the 2016 vertical line, right? So I have a couple ideas. So let's try playing with the line end type. So we can do line end, and there's 3 values. There's butt, there's round, and there's square. So let's try butt. That didn't do anything. Let's do square. So definitely on the left side, that worked really nicely. I'm noticing that this blue line here, which I think is the OECD average, has a little bit of the corner there, right? But wouldn't you know it, when you look at their OECD average, it also has the same corner, right? If we come over on the right, I see some of that as well, but I think what we're going to see is the same thing, right? So like with France up here, you can kind of see the corner there, right? And we see the same corner right there. And then this line here, which I think is for Poland, you can see that corner, as well as for Britain, this line coming up, right? Which is probably actually Canada, not Britain, because this horizontal line is Britain. So I think this works. So again, what we did to solve that was to use line end square. My sense is that line end but basically ends the line right at the x-axis coordinate, right? Whereas line end square adds basically the line width to the end of the line, okay? That makes sense. So line end but, it's flat at the end of the line. Line end square puts basically the thickness of the line width, or the width of the line, at the end of the line. If we had done round, then we kind of see the same type of thing as we saw with but that's going to put a round end on each of our lines. And you know what? I think that actually looks a bit more attractive than having those square edges, kind of like we see here for this OECD line. It's a little bit rounded, and it doesn't seem so, I don't know, rough, if you will, as that OECD average there. Let's roll with that using the round end, and I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. Now what I want to do is think about how we can put a white edge on each of our lines. So one idea that we might consider would be coming back up to geom_line and copying this down, okay? And then what we could do would be like line width of 2.5, and I could then say color equals white. Basically what we want to do, actually this should go before the other geom_line, right? So we're going to have a wider line underneath the thinner line, and the wider line will be white. I don't see the same effect that they had in the original, in The Economist, but if I zoom in, I can see that there is a bit of a gap between the grid line and the line itself. If I make that line a little bit thicker still, so if I take that up to say 2.75, then you can see more of that gap as well, right? So what's happening is it's putting down the white lines, and then it's putting our colored lines on top. But really what I would want to do is for each line to have the white line and then the colored line, and then a white line and a covered line, so that we can see the white edge going across those other lines. There is a package to do this for us, and that is called ggborderline. So let's go ahead and load that package, ggborderline. And if you do the library ggborderline, save. If you don't have that package installed, it'll give you a message here. Otherwise, you can come over to packages, install, and then type in ggborderline, right, to install it. I've already got it, so we're in good shape. I'll go ahead and load that. And so to use this, it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to go ahead and remove this thicker line width one that we made white. So instead of geom_line, I'm going to do geom_borderline. Clean up our tabs here. And if we look at the documentation for geom_borderline, the arguments all look the same as geom_line. The description here says that there's really only two differences, in that there's a border color and a border width. We need to go ahead and add that. So let's come in here, and I'm going to move this show legend false to the end here so I can put all my aesthetics together. And we'll go ahead and do border width equals, let's try 0.2, and then border color to be white. White is the default color. And there we go. We have that nice white edge. And really, we don't see the white edge except when the lines cross each other or when they cross those grid lines. And so that's pretty nice, actually. I think that's a pretty good thickness. Let's see what happens if we bump it up ever so slightly. Let's go up to say like 0.5. That's probably too chunky. And so I'm going to go back and let's maybe do 0.25. So I think that looks great. And yeah, wouldn't you know, geom_borderline does a really good job then of putting in a border to your line. And that is an aesthetic that you could map to another variable, right? So we could perhaps, give our countries colored by their rank, and then we could give them borders colored by, I don't know, their continent, right? Or something crazy like that. I don't know why you would do that, but I think it does a pretty nice job here with white. What would it look like if it was black? Let's go ahead and throw that in and see. And that gives it another interesting look, right? I think the white is pretty cool. All right, so I'll go ahead and undo that and get us our white color back. Looking at this though, I noticed that our lines are in a different order from what the Economist version had, right? In the Economist version, the line from the lower ranking country in 2016 lays on top of the line for the higher ranking country, right? And so we see like South Korea obviously goes all the way across, but then it crosses on top of Turkey. Whereas here, Turkey crosses over top of South Korea. And so if I had to guess, it's doing it alphabetically, right? And so we can also see like OECD average comes down and then it's on top of all of the other lines. Whereas here, it's basically both behind all of the lines except for the one for Hungary, right? To get the order of the lines right, we're going to want to go ahead and turn it into a factor. We'll come back up to the top here, and I think we can make country a factor before we do the pivot longer using the order that we already have in data up here, right? So let's go ahead and do mutate country equals factor on country, levels equals country, and then we'll pipe that into everything else. And now what we see is that South Korea goes over top of Turkey, Japan goes over top of Turkey, and this OECD line here is behind everything except for Hungary, right? So that gives us the same order of the lines, kind of the same overlapping order of the lines as they had in the Economist version. So again, we see that factor function comes in very handy for setting the order even of lines. So now what I want to do is turn our attention to mapping the final rank, the rank for 2024, to the color of the line. So to do that, I'm going to make another column. So I'll create this column with mutate to do final rank. And that is going to be, final rank is going to be the value in the column 2024, okay? And so again, if we look at this, we now see, well, it's off to the right side of the data frame, but it's there, right? So we get that final rank. And then when we pivot longer, we're gonna wanna pivot longer everything but country and final rank. So add that in. And again, now when we look at this, these first couple lines, we find like Iceland, the final rank is 2, the year, the rank, okay? So instead of country for color, we can then do final rank. So now what we see is that the countries that ranked highly, like 1, 2, 3, are dark color, whereas those with a lower rank, again, these are opposite of the numerical convention, are a lighter blue color, okay? And so we would like to have this red color be for the lower rank, like 29, and blue be for the higher rank, things like 1 and 2. And in the middle, we have a gray color. This OECD, we're gonna have to deal with that average value here in a minute or two, but we'll hold off on that for right now. So to get that color gradient, we'll use scale color gradient. And so there's a variety of gradient functions. So there's gradient, which is a single gradient from basically what we have, right? Going from like 1 to 30. You could have scale gradient 2, where you have a low, a medium, and a high value, and then n, where you can have any number of values. You perhaps recall the heat map episode that I did a few episodes back, looking at overdose deaths in Chicago. For that, we use scale gradient n. We might use scale gradient n before it's all said and done, but let's start with scale gradient 2. And so for that, we need a low hexadecimal code, a mid hexadecimal code, and then a high hexadecimal code. And then we need a midpoint. And so our midpoint, I'm going to make 19. And that is because if we look at OECD average in 2024, it's in the 19th slot, okay? So let's now come back to their plot, and I'm gonna use my digital color meter. To get the true red, it's gonna be Turkey, because in 2024, it was in last place, sadly. So I'll go ahead and put the swatch over Turkey, copy that, and then we'll go ahead and plop that in for the low. Then we want to swatch from Sweden. I'll go ahead and copy that blue. And then for mid, I'm going to go ahead and put gray. And let's get this over another line, add that in. And what we're seeing is that my colors are opposite of what I want, but on the whole, we're getting there. So let's go ahead and flip the low and the high. So we'll make this high and this low. And now we have blues at the top, reds at the bottom. But what I'm noticing is that the gradient isn't saturated, right? That the bluest blue is the same blue as Iceland and Sweden, but the South Korea, Japan, Turkey aren't as red as they are in the Economist version. And that's because the OECD average drops down to 19, right? And so that's about like 2/3 of the way down, right? So we're only perhaps using half of the red color range. That if you think about this going from values between like -1 and 1, with OECD average being 0, Sweden is a 1, but Turkey is like a 0.5, right? And so we'd prefer Turkey to be -1. To deal with that, though, we're going to have to use a different scale color gradient function, and that's going to be the N. And so here then, we'll do colors equals a vector of hexadecimal codes. So we'll do that red, the gray, and the blue, and get that to be a vector. And then instead of midpoint, what we're going to do is values. And so for values, we're going to use a function from the scales package called rescale. So we'll do scales, rescale, and then we're going to give it a vector of values corresponding to those three colors. So we'll do C, 30, 19, and 1. Now we see that our reds are a stronger red. So I feel like my reds are getting a bit muted compared to theirs. And so maybe I can lighten the gray that is in the middle there. And so let's see if we go up to like 70 or 90. Okay, that's too light. So let's take that. So let's go up to say 70. And I think that's a pretty good match. Again, the reds aren't quite the same like for Hungary here, but it's okay. I'm not going to worry about it so much. So now we have our lines, we have our colors. So the next thing that I want to do, and I think it's the last thing, is to go ahead and add the labels to the left and right side of the plot. These are going to be positioned at the years 2016 and 2024, albeit with a bit of a nudge, as well as with a left or right justification. I'm going to create a separate data frame for this. And looking at the data pipeline going into the plot, there's a bit of information here that I'm going to want to include with making my labels, right? So I'm going to need to know the year, and it's going to need to be numeric, right? And I'm going to basically want things to be tidy, where I'm going to have data in a column for country, a column for the year, and a column for the rank, right? And so I think what would be better would be to go ahead and take this information, and I'm going to plop it at the end of this pipeline that we use to make data. So I'm going to go ahead and run this up, and I think that I was going to run this to make sure it works, but it didn't work because I have this pipe here at the end. So we'll go ahead and run this. Nothing changes. That's good. And so now what we'll do is go ahead and take data, look at that. And again, we have these columns. I don't need the final rank. So maybe I'll take data, pipe that to select and remove final rank. And that gets us our country, our year, and our rank. And we're going to want to filter to get year equaling 2016 or the year equaling 2024. Good. And so now we have 60 rows, 3 columns. So again, we have a 2016 and a 2024 for each of the countries along with their rank. I'm going to go ahead and call this label data, load that, and then let's rough it in. It's not totally the way we want it, but we'll get there. So we'll add geom text down here after geom borderline. We could do it before, who cares? And we'll do data equals label underscore data. And we'll do AES. So X is going to be the year, Y is going to be the rank, and then the label is going to be the country. And then I don't know if I need to worry about all of the other aesthetics. Yeah, I do, because we don't have a final rank. So I need to then say ignore.aes equals true. And then let's go ahead and add that into the pipeline. Ignoring unknown parameter, ignore AES. It's not ignore, it's inherit. I should have known that when the pop-up didn't come. So inherit, there we go. Inherit AES equals true. Now let's try it again. So it's complaining, final rank not found. And I thought I said inherit AES equals true. I did say it equals true. I want it to be false. I said ignore AES equals true. I did want it to be ignored, but I don't want to inherit it. All right, false. Now we see that we have our country names here, right? They are being centered at 2016 and 2024. They are getting clipped. So we're going to want to turn off the clipping in chord Cartesian. We're also going to want to change the justification. So starting with chord Cartesian, we'll do clip equals off. And now we see our full names for those countries, but we need to go ahead and in our label data, we need to do a mutate for hjust, right? So we'll do mutate hjust equals, we'll do an if else, right? So if year equals 2016, then I want it to be right justified. So that's going to be a 1. Otherwise, we want it to be left justified, which is a 0. And we need a closing parenthesis here. So then coming down to geom text, I think there is an hjust. We'll see. So we'll do hjust equals hjust. Hjust being an aesthetic that we're mapping the hjust column to. Yeah, very good. We now have our countries on the left side being right justified and countries on the left side being left justified. Yes, we have overlap here for like France, Portugal, and New Zealand, and Britain and Canada and Greece and the United States. We'll deal with that. But for now, what I want to do is nudge those out to the right just a smidge. So again, in label data, I'm going to add a nudge, and we'll do the same type of thing, right? We'll copy this if else down. So if the year is 2016, then we want to move things negatively a smidge. So we'll do negative 0.2. Otherwise, we want to go in the positive direction. I'll do 0.2. Now, there isn't a nudge X aesthetic, so that'll be a separate column. So we'll do nudge X equals label data $nudge. So we see that moved the countries in the appropriate direction, left and right. By turning off the clipping, one thing I'm seeing then is the rest of the rounded end of each of the lines. I kind of like this. I'll show you an approach here in a minute for how we can get that to be flush with those lines without losing the rest of our text. So hold on to that. But first, let's pay some attention to the titles of our countries and get that cleaned up before we worry about those line ends. So the first thing I'm going to do is, because it's easy enough, let's go ahead and change the font. To do that, we can come back up into geom text and we can do family equals Roboto. And so recall that we have to set the family in geom text separate from the family in the theme. And that gets us the nice Roboto font. I think it should be a little bit smaller. And so again, we'll come back to geom text and let's do size equals 8, size.unit equals pt. I think that's a little too small. So let's try 9. And I think that's a good size. All right. Now what we want to do is add the rank to the text. Okay. So let's come back up to our label data frame here. So I'm going to create a column called label. And to do this, I think all we need to do is paste the rank for the year to the country name, right? So as we've seen with label data, we have the country and the year and the rank, right? So if I paste the rank to the beginning of the country, we should be in good shape, right? So I'm going to do this actually with the glue package. And that glue package comes with the tidyverse and gives us a function called glue, right? And so we can put in quotes, curly braces, to insert variable names. And so I'm using this because we're going to have a period after the number, but before a space and the country name. So here then we can put rank and then country. And I couldn't find function glue. I think that's because I have to go ahead and do library on glue. And now let's try that again. And it didn't add it because I'm not mapping the label, I'm mapping the country. So let's go ahead then and do label. We now have our ranks added to our country names. However, we are getting a rank for OECD average, and then everything after OECD average is incremented by 1, right? So we need to use a little bit more sophisticated logic for that. So let's come back up here to our mutate statement, and we're going to, I think, use a case when statement here. I think that would be the easiest thing to do. First up, we're going to do country equals OECD average. So if it's the OECD average, then I'm going to modify this by putting stars around it. And so stars are marked down for making something bold, right? So if we render our text in Markdown, this should get bolded, right? So if country is OECD average, then we want it to be bolded. So otherwise, if the year is 2016 and the rank is less than 13, which is the rank of OECD in 2016, then we're going to use a tilde, and then we're going to put in our glue statement, right? Also, if year is equal to 2024, and the rank is less than 19, which is the rank of OECD in 2024, then we're going to repeat this glue statement. Otherwise, we'll say true. Then we're going to copy this glue statement down. And instead of using rank, we're going to use rank -1. So that'll decrease the value of rank by 1 when these conditions are not met, and then glue it all together. And I think we need a final parenthesis here. So we still have the number before the OECD average, but the ranking of the countries checks out, right? So we go up to 29 for South Korea and 29 for Turkey. I think I used a capital A for the average. Yes, and so I had an uppercase A for average. So we'll swap both of these. And so now what we see is that we have OECD average in stars for when we're ready to convert this to Markdown. Before I go into Markdown, because that's going to force us to change a function, let's go ahead and worry about our rankings over here, these countries that tied in 2024. We'll come back up to our label data frame, and I'm going to go ahead and modify rank. And so again, we'll do a case when, and we'll then do year equals 2024, and country equals New Zealand and Portugal. So we'll do New Zealand. So if that's the case, then the rank is going to be 6. And let's copy this down. So if the country is Portugal, then let's make that 7. Otherwise, we'll do true tilde rank. Let's try these two examples to see if we can get that first tie broken apart. So now we see we have Norway, France, New Zealand, all separated, and I'm happy with the way that looks. Now we want to split apart Britain and Canada. We'll do the same type of thing that we did up here. And so again, if the country is Canada, then we want the value to be 15. Wonderful. Now we want to do Greece and the United States. We'll go ahead and copy that line down. And it was United States that needs to be bumped down. And now we want that to be 20. So that didn't move. I wonder if I had a typo. Let's come back up here. Yep, United States. All right. Now we have all of our ties are unbroken. Now what I want to think about is our OECD average, and that we are using Markdown, or would like to use Markdown, to make that line bold. We'll use a function from the ggtext package, which I already loaded because I think I anticipated that we would be using ggtext to use Markdown. I think being able to use Markdown in R is just really powerful, and it's great to have that ggtext package. So we're going to change geom_text to be geom_rich text. I think the arguments are largely the same as what we had with geom_text, but we'll run this, and if I'm wrong, it'll let us know. Sure enough, I was wrong. It's got a couple errors. So it tells us that grid text has encountered a tag it isn't supported yet. OL, that's an ordered list tag. I think that's because I'm using a number followed by a period to make the label, right? And so that is the way in Markdown to make an ordered list. If I put 2 backslashes before that period, that should escape out of it being Markdown. So now that error went away, but now we got this warning message, size unit is an unknown parameter. So we'll come back up to geom_rich text, and unfortunately we can't use the size unit PT. So let's take size down to 2, and our error message goes away, but we now have these funky looking labels and our font is a little bit small. So let's go ahead and turn off the label, right? So we basically have these borders with a solid background. So let's get rid of that, and then we'll worry about the font. But hey, let's point out a good thing. OECD average here is bolded. That's a win, right? And so coming back up to geom_rich text, I'll do label.size equals NA. That should remove the border. Sure enough, that gets rid of the border. That is good. So I don't know that I need to do this, but I could also do fill equals NA to make the labels transparent. And then we could also do margin equals margin zeros all the way around so that there's basically no separation between our text and the label. But again, we turned off label size, which is the thickness of that line for the label. And it's upset about this parameter I added for some reason, margin, and that should probably be label.margin. So we'll add that, and let's put that on a separate line. Now let's turn our attention to increasing the size of our font. So let's increase that to say 3. I think it can go a little bit bigger. Let's go up to say 3.5. It's probably too big. All right, let's split the difference as always and do 3.25. So that's great. I'm noticing that Czech Republic, this 2 on the 25 is kind of getting clipped by the left side of the screen. The right side looks good. I think we should perhaps move in that nudge a bit. And again, we set that nudge back up here. Let's take that down to say 0.1 for negative and positive. Noticing Czech Republic is still getting clipped. Let's go ahead and bring that to 0.05 in both directions. So that does tighten it up a bit, but I don't think we can do much more. I think we need to expand the margin on the left and right. So we had our left margin being 70. What happens if we go up to say 80? Okay, that's too far. So let's take that down to say 75. And that's pretty good. We could perhaps add a little bit of padding to the right side by taking that up to say 80. So I think that looks pretty good. So I keep forgetting that our OECD average line is not the right color. So my idea for the OECD average line is to set that line to NA, or at least the value that we're mapping to the color to be NA, because scale color gradient has an NA value that allows you to set a color for anything that's NA. So you'll recall that we are mapping the final rank to our color, right? So that's right there. If we make the final rank value for OECD average NA, then down here in scale color gradient N, I can set an NA value. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll come back up here to where we had defined data, and recall we have final rank. And so that final rank of 2024, so let's do this. We'll do if else country equals OECD average, again, lowercase average, then let's make that NA. Otherwise, we want the data from 2024. And we need another parenthesis here. And so we can see already that is a darker line than it was previously. And so if we come back and look at scale color gradient N and scroll down to its arguments, we see that it has an NA value and it's using gray 50. So let's do that. We'll come in here and we'll do na.value equals, let's do gray 20. And there we go. We've made it darker. That's almost black though. Let's maybe split the difference a little bit from gray 20 and gray 50, and let's do gray 30. Cool. So now we've got our OECD average taken care of. Now I want to show you how I thought about perhaps removing the rounded edges from those lines. Although I think the rounded edge looks pretty nice and polished. I'll come back up and we are going to do this with a geom v line. I think I'll do it before the rich text. So we'll do geom underscore v line and we'll do x-intercept. So we want it to be the left of 2016 and to the right of 2024. So let's do 2015.9 and 2024.1. And then we can use a thick white line. So we'll do line width equals 2, say, and then color equals white. So let's see what this does. And so you can see that it's already starting to chop off the end of the line. Cool, eh? So we could either bump it closer to the line or we could make it thicker. Maybe we'll do both. So let's up it to 3. And that actually is like perfect. I somehow got lucky, right? So again, what I did was I added a vertical line here on either side of the plot to mask effectively the end of my different lines that had the nice round edge. I'm gonna leave that code in, but for my final version of the plot, I wanna have those round edges because I think the rounded edge just makes it look pretty nice. Again, if you wanna get this code with or without the comment, you can get it down below in the description of this episode. There will be a link to a blog post where you can go and get all the code. Again, on the whole, I think this plot was a lot of fun to make. I got to learn a new package, or at least a new function for a package, which was the ggborderline package that allows us to then use geom_borderline to have that nice edge effect that we see with the white. We brought in that dark line for the OECD average, and we used geom-rich text from the ggtext package to go ahead and bold OECD average. And we saw a variety of things along the way. I know this video is getting a little bit long already. Let me know what you think about this, and perhaps if you have ideas for other ways that you would represent the data. Please be sure that you've subscribed to the channel and you've clicked the thumbs up button. This really does help you and others to see the episode that drops next. What would really make it easier for your friends to know that the next episode is dropped is that you let your friends know about this channel. So I would love it if by word of mouth you spread news about what I'm doing here on Code Club to your friends and colleagues. Otherwise, I will see you next time for another episode of Code Club.